The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
So welcome back to the Integration Podcast. I'm Nick Hedlund. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Integration Journal.
I'm Brennan Graham Dempsey, managing editor of that journal, and along with Nick, director of research at the Institute of Applied Metatheory.
We're here today with our guest, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens, who is going to be deep diving with us into complex integral realism. Sean is the director of Meta-Integral. He's also the chair of the Integral Noetic Sciences Department at the California Institute for Human Science. And he's also the chief culture officer at a 120-person nonprofit. Sean has a deep background in integrative metatheory and has really been one of the leading pioneers in this space. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the show today, Sean.
Yeah, well, thank you. Great to be here with both of you. Super excited to explore complex integral realism, but also, situate that within the landscape of integrative metatheories that both of you have been working with and kind of with the journal supporting. And, because for me, complex integral realism's interesting in and of itself, but I think what's more interesting is kind of what CIR points to in terms of the possibilities of having these big picture theories and dialogue with each other and kind of, and just how do we integrate across multiple theories and all of that. So I'm excited to see where the conversation goes.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe you could actually kind of, speak to that a little bit of like for the folks that are kind of wondering like, how is this project valuable, like bringing together all these big picture philosophies and meta theories. What does that translate to in terms of real world value?
Yeah, good question. I think we got to figure that out. I think that's like one of the big topics in applied integrative meta theory, right? Is how do we translate these really big, sometimes very abstract set of distinctions and ideas around the nature of reality and how people interface with that reality. How do we translate that into boots on the ground, decisions with respect to environmental stuff or business or any number of domains of application. For me, complex integral realism kind of came out of an impulse to place Ken Wilber's integral theory, which I had been specializing in for a decade plus at the time. And I had recently learned about another big integrative meta theory, Roy Bhaskhar's critical realism. And I'd been aware of Edgar Morin's work around that's sometimes referred to as complex thought. So, and because integral theory, a la Wilber, talks a lot about, any theory is true but partial, and made me reflect on, well, in what ways is integral theory itself true but partial? In what ways is it missing something? In what ways is it leaving something out? How is it distorting things? What are its proclivities and its preferences? And how might we become more aware of that? Because when you present yourself as a theory of everything, and in Ken's case, you have about 9,000 pages of material to substantiate your attempt to include everything. It's a lot to kind of get your arms around, and you kind of end up feeling like, yeah, this includes everything, because Wilber's very good at having enough footnotes in the right places to remind you that even though he's saying this in the text, don't forget that actually in this other larger context, here are these other things to keep in mind, right? So you kind of always have almost a sleight of hand where you feel like, well, the way he's framing it in the text kind of seems like he's emphasizing this or excluding that, but then the footnote reminds you like, no, don't think of it that way, right? So you kind of end up, over many, many pages, many, many books, many, many articles going like, yeah, this is a theory of everything. Everything's included. So then what's not included, and how do you even identify that? How do you, highlight that? So I felt that maybe one way of doing that was to place integral theory in deeper dialogue with Roy Bhaskhar's work and Edgar Morin's work. And that kind of, placing integrative meta theories in deep engagement with each other, that would help us, come to better terms around what are the strengths and limitations of each of these approaches. And, Nick and I created the CRIT symposium, Critical Realism and Integral Theory, where for, most of 6 years, essentially, we had 20 to 30, leading scholar practitioners associated with critical realism, and similar amount associated with integral theory, getting together annually for many years, and also working together outside of those conferences and symposiums, and kind of comparing notes, meta-theory notes and applications. And some of the people involved were not adherents to either approach. Some were familiar with Moran's work. Some were, like Mark Edwards, more of kind of a meta studies perspective. But anyways, it was a wonderful experiment that I feel like IM is continuing on with in many respects. So I'm super excited about the work that you're all doing, and also the journal that you guys have launched. And I think a lot came out of that initial, kind of series of conversations, not to mention the books that Nick and I produced with Roy and others,
Yeah.
and, so I think when it comes to like, what's the real world value, I think the common answer is, well, we're in a meta crisis, and the meta crisis is so complex, we need big picture approaches to help us, one, see the meta crisis in its totality and its totally scary fullness, and have the right set of distinctions to really begin to think about how might we approach this. That said, even though one of the volumes that Nick and I did focused on real world applications and had, some interesting examples, I think this is one of the leading edges of IM and this field and the journal. I'll be interested also to hear from either of you around some of the upcoming articles that you guys are reviewing. Like, what are good applications, right? Because that really is the pressure test. Like, I haven't seen a good application of integrative meta theory to, like the meta crisis. I mean, that would be a really big application, but even chunks of it, right? Like, so I've not seen or read something where I'm just like, holy shit, this is it. Like, this is amazing. Like, this is, and maybe that raises the issue of like, what's the scale of application we're talking about, right? Maybe it's more realistic to work applications at a micro or meso level, right? Maybe at a meta or larger level. Maybe we're not there yet. Like, how do we build an applied science of integrative meta theory? Like, where do we start? How do we grow it? I mean, you could say that there are applications in integral education, or that education has a lot of examples of integral education. And, similarly with, Roy's work, there's applications in nursing and education and, environmental studies. And, critical realism has a whole several series in the Routledge lineup of applied critical realism. So, but I'd be curious your thoughts on like, do any of those examples represent what you think of or what you want to see when it comes to applied integrative meta theory? Maybe some of them do, maybe some of them don't. So I'm not even sure that we're clear as a community as to what actually does an application look like, or what would be the criteria, or what would be the, success elements that we would be looking for. So on the one hand, there's like, how do we build meta theory? How do we build integrative meta theory? How do we place different meta theories in dialogue with each other? And then what do the applications look like, right? I almost feel like they're kind of two separate set of activities. And, so I'd be interested in your thoughts and what you're seeing out there. I mean, I've been applying integral theory and critical integral realism, as well, and in the sense that I've been deeply influenced by Bashkar and Moran's work, as well as, other folks like, Jason Strong and his Metamodernism and so forth, to, all kinds of areas: ecology, business, education, coaching. But again, a lot of those applications feel like more kind of micro or surgical in a sense. So, even in the company that I work in, we're making it a deliberately developmental organization, a DDO, based on Robert Keegan's work on his book, And Everyone Culture. And so there's 120 people working there, and we're, developing a culture where people can, move through the adult levels of development as articulated by, Wilbur and many others, and so. And that's a heavy lift, right? It's to apply those ideas and theories to a system like that, it's kind of slow going. We're making great progress, but I've been there a few years, and and it's like it's going to take many more. I know Gail Ochachka has been working on climate change. So yeah, it's like what is a good integral meta theory application? What's your experience? Like, what do you see out there? And given kind of my like kind of loving skepticism around it, even like, are we even there yet? Like, do you agree or disagree with my assessment that there's not a good blow your socks off example out there that like everyone's reading and going, holy smokes, like this is the answer. So what does that say about integral meta theory? Thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, my take on that is sort of not that let's say, you have an integrative meta theory, therefore you can apply that to massive scale phenomena in a way that's just going to be it's going to give you the lever, to move the world. I see it more as having a more expansive lens or framework through which you do everything, right? So like at every scale. So all of the interventions that I would see are going to continue to be micro and meso level interventions because, provided you're not, I don't know, either a president or a dictator somewhere or some, major billionaire CEO of a company who has kind of massive leverage. And there are only a few sorts of people out there, I think, in that kind of camp. Then pretty much any intervention that you do is going to be, hopefully it's going to have legs, it's going to be systemic in nature, but it's not going to be, oh, we're changing the whole system because we got a super, super big integrative meta theory. So I think that the challenge is more, as you were kind of saying at the beginning, what's being left out, because we all bring frameworks and lenses to the work that we do. But if we're leaving more of the picture out, then one, we're going to be less effective, and two, we might be effective in ways that are unhelpful. So an expanded scope, I think, just makes any degree of well, I'll say interventions, but that sounds a bit bold. I mean, even just moving through the world in relationships in terms of the way we show up at our various jobs, the research that we do, et cetera. All that is aided by a more comprehensive picture. And I think, I mean, this may be sort of my read, but I'd be curious. Yeah, maybe you have your own thoughts about this, both of you. But I think there can be a little bit of frustration in a community of folks engaged in meta theorizing because people might be working with the false assumption that, oh, if we get the big picture, then we'll solve the big problem. But again, I feel like what you're really looking at is the bigger picture you've got, the more of the system that you're seeing. And so the more you're kind of appreciative of the fact of how complex and emergent and dynamic and recursive all this stuff is. And in a kind of frustrating way for people, I think, who do that sort of thing, you also see in a sense what the scale of your agency is, right? I was just recently talking to Daniela Beaumatter about this one on her Third Attractor podcast, where sort of like you get a 30,000 foot view of something, but that doesn't mean then that you can just sort of change that landscape from a 30,000 foot view.
Right.
So I think it would probably just be helpful, I think, if people understood more what these tools do and what they don't do, to kind of have a shared set of expectations around what that is. I do think, though, that these tools do make things more tractable, and they, being able to situate, oh, okay, I mean, to use a tool, a kind of, conceptual tool like the quadrants, and being able to think, oh, okay, am I accounting for this and that? Am I appreciating that, I have to make that doing an intervention here doesn't necessarily change anything over here, and blah, blah, blah. You have a better sense of the kinds of things that are going on, and then understand your own agency and intervention better. So that's kind of how I look at it. And I think that we can, in engaging more comprehensive meta-theoretical synthesis work, get better tools for doing that kind of a thing. And yeah, understand its sort of repercussions that way. I don't know. Does that, what are your thoughts, Nick?
Let me respond to that and then kind of set Nick up to add to what you've said and then respond to kind of my thoughts. Yeah, I really like that, Brendan. That all tracks and resonates for me. I think managing expectations about what do applications look like, and because you're right, it's like there's nothing out there right now that really gets macro traction. Integral or not, integrative or not. It's like it's likely our cultural wars are such that we just can't affect change at that level because there's just not enough, kind of intersubjective coordination across so many different perspectives. Like that's a pretty big lift. And we're just not going to get the institutional buy-in for probably some time, to affect change on massive scale using these big pictures. When I think of Wilbur, one of the things that really I think makes his approach stand out compared to a lot of the other more recent integrative meta theories or big pictures is essentially his ILP, his integral life practice, that he has a framework, whether you like it or not, or disagree with it, or would do something different. He bakes into his integral theory a set of injunctions or practices or ways of thinking about how do you transform your own human self, right, in the different dimensions and layers, right, and sometimes it can feel very prescriptive and kind of you're ticking the boxes and all of that, and that can be a fair critique, but I think it misses kind of the value and the point of it. And then similarly, so Kin has a way of applying integral theory to oneself. And I think that's part of why integral theory has had kind of such traction as people have really resonated with that. You don't see that with a lot of the other meta theories in the same way. And if anything, they often will just kind of defer to Wilbur and, as kind of, oh, well, if you're interested in that, go over and, Wilbur can help you with that. And then Bhaskar, and this is why in Complex Integral Realism, I was so drawn to including Bhaskar in a deeper dialogue with Wilbur, is I was not satisfied with the ways in which Wilbur provides a way of thinking about social critique, addressing institutions, transforming institutions, and critical realism is really capable and has a good track record of doing that. And I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to critical realism, is they see a way through kind of a modernist and postmodern kind of, choice, and they see a third choice, an integrative choice that can preserve some of the valuable elements of modernism and postmodern, but then critique social institutions and transform them in a liberative or Edmonian way. And so Bhaskar has a number of tools and techniques that critical realists use to critique social institutions in service of making those better supportive of liberation and agency and, kind of raising the tide for all boats. And so I think complex integral realism sees like, okay, Wilbur's got a good handle on transforming the human being. Bhaskar has a good handle on helping to transform society and social institutions. And we really need both and to put both in deeper dialogue with each other. So Nick, I'm curious, given your background in critical realism, what Brandon was saying as well, like kind of what's your sense of the Bhaskarian kind of contribution to application in this context? What do you see in critical realism that other meta theorists should be taking into consideration? And where does Bhaskar or critical realism not go far enough that a more explicit integrative meta theory maybe brings into relief and highlights additional ways we should be thinking about applications?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I mean, the first pass is, I would say, critical realism brings in this kind of emancipatory lens. So the idea of emancipatory social science and using the framework of critical realism to do emancipatory social science, which identifies real world social pathologies and sort of diagnoses them. And then that kind of sets the stage for an emancipatory, movement or some sort of transformative intervention. And I think that is a really powerful lens that, hasn't been actualized, enough. And I think there's a lot more untapped potential in that domain. I think there is definitely good work going on, in those spaces. Sometimes sometimes the critique of the social pathologies, goes back to the systems level, kind of the institutional systems level, and points to kind of some of the problematic incentive structures and the way that our economy is structured and basically capitalism. And so I've always been appreciative and skeptical of those kinds of critiques that point back to capitalism as kind of the cause of our problems. Of course, it's on one level, it's like, yes, of course, and that's a huge thing that shouldn't be overlooked. And at the same time, well, what are the conditions for the possibility of creating a capitalist economic system? Where does that come from? Where are the kind of, and when you dig into that question, you see that a lot of it has to do with culture, worldviews, the kind of superstructure from which that kind of social structure emerged. And so I think that, that's a powerful lens. I mean, I also think that the kind of visionary aspect of critical realism, they don't call it that, but that's how I name the kind of what in critical realism they call concrete utopianism. So really looking at like what are not abstract utopianism. And I know some people have an issue with the idea of utopia as some sort of perfected,
Right.
abstract place. And yes, there is that version of it. I think Bhaskar and the whole kind of tradition that's he's coming from in talking about utopia is different than that. You can call it a protopia. I like that word too, like a better, better place, or a EU utopia, like a good place, a healthy place. But the idea there is to envision possible futures that are concretely grounded. They're not just abstract fantasies of how the world could be. They're actually grounded in real world constraints and dynamics. And you can make a rational case that this kind of world is possible if only we could, actualize it. And I think that's really, really important domain for a big picture theorizing. Is to actually think through, like saying, what does a new economic system look like? Not just critique capitalism in a deconstructive move, but to try and envision what a different kind of economic system would actually look like. And then the last step is the theory of transition or transformation. How do you get from where we are right now to this protopia, to this concrete utopia? So I think, those are some of the pieces that come up for me in response to your question there, Sean.
Yeah, I love this phrase, emancipatory social science. I think that's one of the big contributions of Bhaskar. I don't see like hardly any of the other integrative meta theories or big picture approaches having anything like that. Like it seems like most of them are almost like descriptive, like they're trying to describe reality in a big complex way, right? They're not like normative or prescriptive of like, okay, given that, here's what we should be doing to make things better, right? You don't see that a lot. I mean, metamodernism is interesting in its Dutch and Nordic schools, right, with kind of applications in art and applications in the political sphere and some of the political movements or parties that have kind of been informed by metamodernism, though I'm not up to date on like the current traction they're getting or not getting. So I'd be curious if there's any good examples there that you know of. And I think it also raises the issue that maybe one of the applications, in a sense, is it's not anything concrete or specific. It's more related to just integrative thinking and feeling and sensing and perception, right? Like if we get better at thinking and feeling and approaching things from an integrative perspective, regardless of which big picture theory we're informed by, that in itself, like kind of becoming more integratively literate, right? That we might not be able to put our finger on specific applications, but if more people are thinking and feeling integratively, like that's got to be a good thing. I'm inclined to think like it's got to produce better applications and solutions, as people are navigating in multiple perspectives and having to include, larger, time frames and so forth. So that could be another part of managing the expectations that you were talking about, Brandon. Is like, yeah, like having concrete, specific, applications in different domains or transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary context is great. That's something we're working on, and here are examples. And part of it too is just building your capacity as a human being to see, think, feel, and respond more integratively, right? Because I think sometimes the focus on application is kind of more a focus on like things out there, and that's in some ways that's just kind of the problem, right? It's like how
Yeah.
self as instrument, how do we transform our own modes of being, and that's as noble a task, right? And that's kind of Wilber's developmental psychological science, right? And in complementary relationship with Bashkar's emancipatory social science.
Yeah, I would add too, I mean, if you think about the sciences, or like CERN, right? Like, some people will ask the question like, well, what's this gonna give us? How can we
Right.
apply whatever's coming out of, but I think that that's really interesting. And it's not, obviously, it's a good question to be asking, but what's interesting is that at the heart of all these endeavors, as I kind of think about them, is the effort to understand reality better, right? And what falls out of that will be all sorts of applications across all sorts of scales, right? In terms of, yeah, the daily, how we live and how we, change our own internal worlds, but also then in terms of how these things get into culture and how they get into systems. But along the way, for many frameworks, paradigms, worldviews, the goal, I think, has just been trying to get into deeper touch with reality. And so jumping right to, we need some kind of, world changing scale application of this. I think just misses the reality of how worldviews actually change, collective scale phenomena. Because it's not like, oh, okay, now we've got this, now we can go do this, right? So, which again, I think is actually part of what big picture theorizing also informs you about, is you look at the reality of how people have engaged deeper with reality over time, and then you see how things have unfolded culturally, in terms of the applications of those things. But yeah, just to make that point, that there's a sense then in which, like if you were to look at CERN and say, oh, well, was it worth it or something, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, all we have is this, for whatever it was, like $20 billion, and all we got was a lousy boson, like this sort of thing. But now we actually have a deep understanding of, of subatomic reality in some profound way. Obviously, we're still, scratching our heads around all sorts of things, but that kind of advance of knowledge is, I think, the movement of getting into deeper alethic resonance. And from that, from all versions of that fall out all of the applications that we use at every single scale. And yeah, I guess just to underscore that point. So it sort of has it's inherently valuable, because that is the very nature of not just philosophizing, but relating to the world and coming into closer contact with it.
One of the things that I think is kind of unique in Wilber's approach that, again, I don't see occurring really in the other big picture approaches. And when I say that, I'm thinking of like a dozen or so different big picture approaches that I'm assuming many of your listeners are familiar with. And that is his integral methodological pluralism. Like Ken takes a meta view on method, and a lot of their approaches don't. A lot of them focus on just, in integral ecology, the book that Michael Zimmerman and I co-authored, 15 years ago. We developed this framework of the who times the how times the what. Right, the who is the subject, right? The epistemology, like how do you know? The how is what methods are you using to know and disclose reality, and then the what is, the nature of reality in and of itself. And so a lot of the big picture focuses on the what, like trying to have a better map of the complex reality. Not many of them focus on the who, like the subject, and how do we understand our epistemological categories? How are we more self-reflective of that? How do we transform that? Wilber kind of excels with a set of distinctions to reflect on the who. Bashkar, Moran, and Wilber all have a lot to say about the what. Again, I'm talking about in the context of complex integral realism. And the how, Wilber, Moran, and Bashkar also have a lot to say about the how, but Wilber develops a kind of, his integral methodological pluralism, which is pretty unique and very powerful. I mean, whether or not you embrace the the 4 quadrants and the 2 zones per quadrant, inside, outside, and, the 8 families of methodological orientation, I think the bigger point is it's a very elegant way of including, mixed methods, first, second, third person data, honoring a wide range of methodological approaches, and reflecting on how different combinations of those methods enable different types of disclosures of reality, and what that relationship is between the observer, the subject, the who, the method, the how, and then what, and what gets disclosed or what becomes available as a result of the methods that you're using. Because if we're going to talk about applications, we have to talk about methods, like what are the methods used in the applications. And so if we don't have a meta model of methodology and an understanding of how different types of methods either work or don't work together, like how do you integrate third person data and first person data, right? So like neurophenomenology, an emergent field in neuroscience, is all about. Like, how do we bring first person reports of meditators with third person brain images of meditators, and how do we understand the relationship between those two data sets? And they're still trying to figure that out. And that's just kind of two different methods around one, simple action like meditation, right? So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done around integrating methodological approaches and the data that gets revealed in the combining different methods. And this is why Moran's transdisciplinarity is interesting, Wilbur's kind of post disciplinarity approach, and Bashkar's interdisciplinary. He tended to frame things in an interdisciplinary approach, right? So I think that's an important metatheoretical topic that I don't see many people talking about. Like, we're really captivated with the what, like, oh, I want the biggest map of reality and to know that that's a comprehensive view, but we're not talking about the method much, or the methods.
Yeah, and I mean, in that regard too, I mean, I think Mark Edwards is worth mentioning in his work on metamethodology and on the integral meta studies, and the emphasis on method, and the kind of the need for integral meta theorizing, integrative meta theorizing to be methodologically transparent and move beyond his whole idea of traditional scholarship, which is kind of like not very conscious and reflexive about exactly what you're saying, like the methods that we're using and the kind of background structures that are actually very much implicated in our theorizing.
Yeah, so building on that, I mean, we were all together in the previous conversation last week, and Mark was there. What would each of you say to kind of build on his critiques, concerns, his insight, maybe as an entry point around, this idea of science, approach to, metatheory, scientific metatheory versus philosophical metatheory, right? Nick, you introduced this distinction in one of the charts in our book, right?
Mhm.
So I'm just curious, from you, um, what's your sense? Because Mark was highlighting that these are kind of two separate activities that should be in dialogue, but we shouldn't confuse them. We shouldn't replace one with the other. We need both. They need to be in dialogue, right? So if we're talking about applications, can philosophical meta theory really have applications without developing method, or methods of theory building, or what's your sense of kind of like how do we link and build on some of the points Mark Edwards was saying last week?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think probably, Mark and I are coming from a somewhat similar place in spirit, but on some level, I want to say that I disagree with like that formulation. I think that yeah, they need to be like understood to be distinct and have differentiation. Like I'm not trying to blur the line per se, but I think that, for example, in my understanding, science is itself unintelligible without philosophy. Like you actually need, like science can't actually understand itself deploying the tools of science alone. Like it has to deploy the tools of philosophy, and particularly philosophy of science, to be able to even understand the conditions for its own possibility and
Well, let me
therefore
just
make itself
ask that,
intelligible. Yeah.
because almost every scientist I talk to knows nothing about philosophy of science, right? And I teach philosophy of science in my graduate program, and I'm always amazed that I'm just like, oh, I wish scientists like just like read a basic book on philosophy of science. So how does your point apply to that? The fact that, like, I agree with you, like at a big level, but I'm also seeing most scientists don't give a shit and don't know anything about philosophy of science. And if you bring it up, it's just annoying to them. So they seem to be practicing science without any awareness of the history of science or the philosophy of science, even though arguably it's kind of, it's informing them unconsciously and
Yeah.
institutionally. So I'm
Yeah,
just
it's a really weird dynamic. It's like they climbed a ladder, then they kicked away the ladder, and then said, "What ladder? Ladders don't exist. What are you talking about? I'm just standing on this perch magically." And it's pretty bizarre, and I think it reflects the kind of broader cultural dynamic of like the Enlightenment gap and like the kind of physicalism and the split between the inside and the outside and the natural sciences and the humanities and all this stuff. But I agree with you. I think that would be one of the most powerful interventions is like if you could make philosophy of science education required for all scientists.
Right.
But yeah, I agree. But what can philosophy do? It is kind of it is occupy this kind of like central role in the to me it's like at the center of the circle of the sciences, right? And so it's not just another discipline. It's kind of the foundational discipline for all disciplines in a sense. But it only can really make very general and abstract claims. Like using transcendental methods, you can really only arrive at very generalized claims. And so there's not much granularity or detail to what you can say in that strictly philosophical register. So you need to have this integration of science and philosophy where philosophers then are really looking at and this is what good philosophers do. They really look deeply at the results of the sciences, like my friend Matt Segal. Like he's a philosopher, but he's like deep in dialogue with all these biologists and ecologists and physicists and whatnot, and he's unpacking, from how do we interpret these things and make sense of them? How do they cohere with a deeper philosophical understanding of reality? And so there's this kind of interpenetration where the science is informing the philosophy and the philosophy is informing the science. And I think that understanding is critical. And I think so. I can't really quite agree with how Mark sees them as they should be separate. It's hard for me to understand that other than in some sense he is a scientist, perhaps somewhat guilty of the very dynamic that we're talking about.
So with this distinction between scientific metatheory and philosophical metatheory, which you yourself introduce in our book, do you feel that both versions of metatheory can and benefit from methodological development? So, like should philosophical metatheory make a stronger commitment, people who are practicing it and us who are discussing it, to try and build those meta theories through a methodological process, either along the lines of what Mark proposes, kind of, or some similar kind of process, or is philosophical meta theory, for some reason, exempt of the need to be more transparent and consistent with its methodological practices for developing meta theory? Because Mark makes a good case that scientific meta theory absolutely should do that. And I'm good with that. So I'm curious if you feel philosophical meta theory should be held to the same kind of level of methodological transparency, and or is kind of armchair theory building a la Wilbur, Bashkar, Moran, whoever, like totally fine and okay in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Mark's critique, and it was very influential for me of like his critique of traditional scholarship and the lack of methodological transparency and epistemic reflexivity and all that. But he seemed to apply that only to like doing meta theorizing in like a social science context. But I think that applies to doing meta theorizing in a natural science context and also philosophy and humanities kind of context. And I do think this is a critical area for big picture theorizing to continue to develop is getting more nuanced about the philosophical methodology. And often, I mean, you get a kind of straw man dynamic set up where like, oh, scientists are all about methodology and there's a whole social validation process. And then philosophy is just sort of like speculative metaphysics, where it's just sort of like conjecture about all this stuff. And there's not really grounded in any kind of evidence, and there's not really any way to falsify it. So it's just like, yeah, go on with your armchair speculating. But that's a total straw man idea of what philosophy is. Yes, there are versions of philosophy that kind of cross over with theology and stuff that are more like that. But I think what we're talking about with philosophical meta theorizing is, as I mentioned in my research forum talk, is like it has to be procedurally rational, as Habermas would call it, which in other words is saying like it has to be methodologically transparent. It has to be open to critique, falsification, refutation, or validation by a community adequate. And I do think that general conversation of philosophical methodology is underdeveloped, and there are a lot of philosophers that are very much guilty of like under being under reflexive about their own methodologies that are informing their work. So
Because I've often thought about complex integral realism, and Mark's pointed this out, that I'm as guilty as anyone of, if not like kind of the poster face for it, where like I brought Wilbur, Bashkar, and Morin into the same room, and arguably I kind of cherry pick kind of aspects of their theories, put it together into a thing called complex integral realism. And isn't this great? It's a wonderful preservative synthesis of these three big pictures, and now we have an even bigger picture that benefits from all of them. And I've often wondered, what would it look like for me to kind of develop a complex integral realism 2.0, where I do something along the lines of what Mark Edwards is suggesting, and identify the lenses, integral lenses associated with each approach, and kind of rebuild CIR, from the ground up using a kind of a methodological approach. And would that version of CIR look a lot different, or just a little bit different from the current version in my mind and what I've written and published about? And so, I'm curious about, yeah,
It'd be
Brendan.
amazing if you wanted to write an article on that for the Integration Journal. We'd
Yeah,
love to see
I
that.
bet. No, yes, I am open and interested in that. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but this highlights a trajectory that I'm very curious about, and I would love to see other integrators kind of wrestling with these topics and issues. And what would it look like? Because as far as I know, I have not seen anyone basically take up Mark Edwards' invitation to build metatheory in the way that he's proposing, right? And so I think some of us need to do that, and we need to compare notes, and kind of, like we need to test drive the go-kart around the block a few times, right? Because I think he's onto something. And I'm curious, like, why have none of us taken that up in the last, 10 plus years? Like, why is there still kind of this tendency to just armchair it and kind of combine things? I mean, Nick, in your chapter in this book, you are very rigorous in your comparison and contrast of critical realism and analytical theory, kind of looking at each of them through the lens of the other. And that, to me, was its own kind of methodology. You articulated a methodology of comparison and contrast, and you identified a number of insights as a result of a methodological process that you went through and that you applied to both theories, right? So I mean, there is some kind of method there. I mean, I don't know if that could be extracted out and codified as a particular possibility of comparative integral metatheory, a method for, or what your thoughts are on the method you use there, or if that just is an example of the procedural rationality that you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I did take Mark's, kind of critiques seriously and did my best. But what I felt like was it was sort of, it didn't really, I couldn't see how it really worked in the context of looking at critical realism and integral theory.
Oh.
And that led to me kind of going, wait, why does it seem like these are kind of apples and oranges? And that led to the alpha, beta, gamma distinction, the
Right.
philosophy and science distinction.
Right.
And so I feel like Mark's method is, I really understand it as a social science method,
Yeah.
really. That might have kind of broader implications of like how you could apply that in philosophy and so on. But what he actually articulates is a social science method. And if you have a metatheory alpha, philosophical metatheory like critical realism, I'm not sure how well it works to go in and deploy that. So I tried to take, kind of the essence of what he was saying and tailor that to a philosophical methodology that I called hermeneutical dialectics and
Right.
immanent critique. And so I think there was like a very transparent methodology there. It's just not happening in a social science context.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
those are great distinctions. Brendan, I'm curious, not to put you in the metamodernism box, but I mean, that's an area that you've spent a lot of time in and have a background in. Like, given the themes Nick and I have been bouncing back and forth the last few minutes, like, where does metamodernism fall in all of this? Like, does it have a method? Like, what are the new emerging forms? Like, are the metamodern political parties dead? Kind of like, I'm just curious because so many have like pointed to metamodernism as like, that's the next thing, right? Like, that's integral theory. Integral theory is passe. It's so like 1980s, and like metamodernism's, here. So I'm just curious, kind of like, what's the current take on where metamodernism is, how it interfaces with these issues, and where's it going, and how might it address some of these issues?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say we got to get you as a co-host on this podcast because you're asking great questions of us. So we
Okay.
gotta make this a yeah.
Try it.
No, I Well, there's way too much I could say on that, so I'll try to be really succinct. I mean, I do always like to emphasize up front, particularly if I'm talking to maybe an audience that's more familiar with integral theory or knows metamodernism from integral theory, that metamodernism is kind of a diverse discourse with a number of different streams that have led into it. You've got the cultural studies element, which some people could call the Dutch school. You've got the Hansi Freinacht Nordic school. But now you've got Jason Storm and his metamodernism. You've got the work that I'm doing and Layman Pascal are doing. You got Greg as and Bobby Azarian and John Vervaeke. And it's sort of a various levels, and then some people using the term who've subsequently turned to different terms, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's a discourse, and it's got different elements in it. I think that it does strike me as being where a lot of energy and innovation are, because I think that and I've seen this a number of times, and this came up in our conversation with Bruce as well, of sort of like the integral movement, for example. There was more than Wilbur going on there, but at the end of the day, a lot of people, it kind of kept coming back to, well, what are the books that Ken Wilber wrote, or there was this integral journal space and academic space, and there was rich debate happening. But at the end of the day, if you were just going to ask someone what's integral theory, they're going to point to Ken Wilber. And so I think that metamodernism and its discourse has become a sort of repository where a lot of that kind of debate ended up and is being moved forward and is still actively sort of being processed and carried forward. And in some ways, with the Hansi Freinacht stuff, you had a very deliberate attempt to like, nope, we're taking a lot of these ideas, but we're also mixing them with these ideas and a bunch of other stuff that isn't even in kind of either of these. And we're starting a new thing here. And now you can point to the Hansi Freinacht books, right? And so as sort of a new genesis, a new originating sort of seminal lineage in some way. So, what I see happening there is complex. I think at the same time too, there's been its own sort of crest in some ways in terms of some of these lineages. Some of these players aren't even in the conversation anymore. Some of them have sort of plateaued. They're not really producing literature anymore. For me, what feels really alive is Jason Storm's work. He has a new book coming out. Actually, I think it already published, Genealogy of Genealogies.
I got it from Amazon today.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the work he's doing. Of course, he and I are working on the Metamodern Theory and Praxis journal, and so there's a lot that's coming in through that stream that I feel like is also drawing on the energy of the cultural studies and has a whole kind of cultural ethos and sensibility and vibe component to it. That's a younger generation. It's all this. So, yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I'm trying to do what I can in that space, but I've also been really heartened to see a kind of blurring of categories, right? So it doesn't mean as much as it used to, whether you use the word metamodern or integral or integrative or whatever. I think people are increasingly kind of playing in the same sandbox together. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. One last thing I guess I'll just say about my own work on that front is, one of the things that I've felt has been an ongoing kind of albatross around kind of the integral neck is, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you mentioned all the footnotes and stuff, but there's also things that just aren't there or that are wrong or that are weirdly connected. And so people have been trying to either make these kind of piecemeal critiques over time, but like to get sort of a fresh start and just be like, all right, let's try this, and do it all the way from the beginning and go as deep as we can and draw on all the contemporary science and draw on Wilbur and Wilberian integral where we can, also point out its incompletenesses and errors and that sort of thing, and do this other thing. That I think is an exciting prospect. So like for me, the evolution of meeting series that I'm writing, this kind of multi-volume thing, is trying to do that the best way that I can, while deeply engaging with all these models, but trying to also bring it as up to date as possible. So I don't know. That's a lot of word vomit as a response to that question, which touches so many different things. Maybe the last thing I'll just say is that I think, yeah, apart from that kind of convergence of integral and in metamodern thought in various ways, I do think that there is a real energy and momentum and inertia to the metamodern kind of discourse space that we're going to continue to be seeing that unfolding. And so I think that there's a lot of life there, I guess, and it's where I'm seeing the bulk of that at the moment. So Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there, but there's a lot more I could say.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
Well, go ahead, Nick, if you're going to say something.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, one thing I love about metamodernism is just this sort of sensibility of, just trying to iterate, basically, like learn from, like appreciate what has been done, and then say, like, I think a lot of it looked at kind of how these things play in application, right? Like how when you take integral theory type ideas and try and do a political movement, what happens? And
Right.
they found that, like, there's a lot of problems with it, and that have to do with some of the the deep theoretical questions. And so there was an attempt to revise and iterate. And so I think of like the idea of integrative metatheory 2.0 as very much a resonant idea with the idea of like a metamodernism, and what that movement is trying to do is saying, hey, we need more rigor, we need more methodological transparency. We might need to update the aesthetic. There might be some, kind of onto-theological metaphysics from Buddhism and whatever that's been, sort of smuggled in the back door, and not everyone is loving that, especially in Europe, and so these kinds of considerations I think are really important.
Speaking of metamodernism, I think one of the most interesting examples of application is, articulated in the book, The Nordic Secret, right? Like that for me, when I read that, I was like, wow, this is really cool. This is very interesting. But it's a retroactive, view, right? It's like it's looking back at something that happened 100 years ago and using kind of an integral frame to understand why that was successful, why it's interesting, how those small groups and educational contexts supported a certain kind of growth and development, right? So to me, it's kind of, again, it's kind of like ironic. It's like one of the best examples I can think of is kind of like a very dated kind of retrofit example, right? Like it's like what's the next version of the Nordic Secret that's like a contemporary example of like some really cool, and it could be very micro scale, like to our points earlier, like it doesn't have to even be meso, or obviously likely would not be macro scale, right? But what would be like something that would just turn heads, where they would just go, wow, and it wouldn't even have to be like a comprehensive application of any one big picture approach, right? And I think this is kind of point you were making, Brendan, right? And that we could just take elements, like you did, Nick, with your chapter and your comparison. Like you took some core critiques and methods and approaches from Bashkar and others, and just kind of use those. We're very clear about what you're using and how and why and the sequence. And so, it's like you don't have to apply integral theory on total to some topic, right? It's like you don't have to do an all quadrant, all level analysis. You can just do a quadrant analysis or just a level analysis, right? So many of these big picture approaches offer distinctions and maps and frameworks that you can use and apply and combine them in different ways from different meta theories, right? Just
Yeah.
few
Well,
lenses.
I would just say, I mean, again, like so much of this, I think, is already informing the conversation in a really important way. I mean, if you look at the meaning crisis as an idea, I mean, Nick talking about the existential crisis component of the meta crisis is really important, and the fact that people are tuning to that element in a really important way, and this has very wide kind of cultural uptake, means that this is part of the conversation where you're looking at something like the meta crisis, but you're not just seeing ecology or wealth inequality or whatever. You're seeing there's a deep inner kind of a kind of psychological existential aspect to this that's operating at the level of meaning making and values and worldview, and so again, just having that in the picture, I think, is helpful for us when we're navigating these complex issues, because if you leave that out, that's really huge. I want to come back to more complex integral realism while we still have you, and have a few more minutes to dig into that a little bit more. You know, one kind of question we ask folks in these podcasts is about their sense of their own models, or whatever model they're representing, its weaknesses, its limits, its what's still at the edge, what's unaccounted for, that sort of thing, what's missing still. You already gestured maybe a little bit to maybe there's a lack of a certain level of methodological transparency, or some kind of reflexivity or something. But anything else you would say, if you were to, wonderfully, if possible, write some kind of article on a
Right.
complex integral realism 2.0, how that might look different, or what you would add or include at that point?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a few things that come to mind. one is what we talked about would be that I just kind of armchaired it. I was very familiar with Wilbur's work. I was increasingly familiar with Bashkar's work. I was as familiar with Morin's work as I could be, given only like 15% of his materials translated into English. And, I'd read that, but it leaves a lot untranslated and unavailable to an English speaker. So I think a more systematic and methodological kind of, evolution of CIR, informed by some of the insights from Mark Edwards. But Nick, I thought a lot of your points were really good around maybe Mark's approach is best suited in a social science context. But so I'd be curious to kind of explore like how far could I take Mark's insights and where would they kind of peter out. I think another area would be I had a set of like 10-point criteria for choosing integral theory, critical realism, and complex thought. I think if I was to add anything, I'm very familiar with the other 10, 12 big picture approaches out there. None of them really strike me as something I need to include in complex integral realism other than Jason Storm's work. So I would want to include his metamodernism. Like I think he does a lot of good, interesting things there. I think most of the other approaches are essentially, for me, covered by one of those big three that I'm already including. And I might be able to augment some of, Wilbur's or Bashkar's or Morin's work based on some of the other figures in the space and their theories. But it's only Jason Storm's work that I see bring something different that's not already in those big three, and that I'd want to more deeply engage and see kind of how can complex integral realism, evolve in light of a deeper, kind of dialogue with Storm's work. And then the other piece is complex integral realism, as originally formulated, does not explicitly, kind of dialogue or engage the anomalous, and that's something I've really focused on for the last 5-6 years. I feel that complex integral realism is compatible with the work I've been doing in anomalous studies and the research I'm doing around super experiencers and all of that. But I would like to further develop the implications of CIR in the context of anomalous phenomenon. And I feel that this is one of the things that many big picture approaches leave out, often by design. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to go there. And as I often joke, how big is your integral toe, theory of everything, and, what does your quote unquote everything leave out? Well, most of the big picture approaches leave out the anomalous, right? And, they generally leave out spiritual, even the causal and non-dual, right? Wilbur's, one of the few that goes there. Bashkar includes it in his own kind of pedestrian way, a kind of a secular version of non-duality with the cosmic envelope and so forth. So I want to continue to develop CIR in a way that allows me to really engage non-duality and the implications metaphysically of non-duality, and then the anomalous. Because for me, that's what makes an integral theory most interesting. Is like, can it account for and give some insight into anomalous phenomena? Because for me, the anomalous phenomenon points to the edges of reality and our current map making, and it's so, like Kepler's map, was expanded, was trying to incorporate all the anomalous like orbits, and like that led to the heliocentric, right? So there's something valuable. There's a lot of good in the philosophy of science. A lot of good breakthroughs have occurred when people stopped ignoring the anomalous data points and found a way to dialogue with it. Right. So I think there's something to be done around that with CIR, and something I'm currently working on.
One thing that comes up for me, just to throw my little 2 cents into that methodological transparency thing that you just brought up again, and you and Nick were talking about earlier, there does seem to be the danger of a kind of almost, well, one, like mission creep, but also navel gazing. The more time one spends on unpacking one's own methodology, in the sense of like, do you say at a certain point, and then I found this book by chance in a library, so I read it, and then like at what level of detail do you feel one has to like kind of really unpack every kind of detail about what led to what to be fully transparent is an interesting thing. And then there's also just the challenge of kind of endless recursivity, right? Like, it's sort of like, oh, is it just a matter of stating what your criteria are? Well, why does one have criteria, right? Like, do you have to have criteria for your criteria and then criteria for your criteria? So I'm which is not a knock against the idea of being more transparently specific about the methodology. But I mean, to your credit and Nick's credit, I mean, I think those anthologies that you guys put together are already doing so much incredible work on that front, getting really into the details of these symposia and what the process was and everything in a really unprecedented way. One thing though that does feel to me to be something that's still missing is the criteria of what counts as a meta theory, as a big picture, right? And I'd love to see your version of that. I mean, you gave an example in your talk about, you really felt like all the three big thinkers you were drawing on all had a lot to say about culture, about, I don't know, like the what and the I and the we and all of that, right? That there was something like they touched every point of that in a major way, in a way that wasn't maybe found in other writers. But I would be curious if we could get more systematic, because so much of the work that we're doing really requires us, I think, to talk about, not just in integral theory, but like integrative theories, meta theories. Right. And so what are our criteria for that? And there'd be few people better positioned to help in an endeavor like that than yourself. So I still think that we could do better to get more explicit about that. And that's just a observation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Going back to your point around, the navel gazing, at what point is it no longer productive to be transparent about your method, or no longer really feasible? Totally agree, though. I'm making this up. I would call that a level 6 issue, and we're at level 2 status. So it's like, yeah, of course, put a pin in that, but like we got a lot of work to do to
fair.
Be more transparent about our methods before we have to worry about that issue. Yeah, and as you mentioned, a reference, in the talk that I gave recently, I kind of walked through like 10 different criteria as to why I felt those three theories that make up complex integral realism, should be included and considered as integrative meta theories. And when I taught last summer a course on varieties of integral, and I had like 13 or 14 different big picture approaches, I ended up referring to the collection, as big picture approaches, because they all were big picture, but not all of them were integrative meta theory. Not all. A couple of them were arch theories. A few of them were integral theories, and arguably a few maybe could be not even considered that, right? So yeah, I think, and that was one of the tensions that came up during the course. It was like, well, and people get really sensitive about it. If some people say, well, that approach is an integrative meta theory, and I'm like, well, no, actually, it's not, right? Like using these criteria, you're hard pressed to call it that, right? It's like, even if it's a really big view, like it's not, it's kind of siloed and isolated. It's not really, it's kind of, it's not integrating across multiple domains, right? So yeah, I think kind of operationalizing the definition of like, unit theories and integral theories and integrative meta theories, and then arch theories, and like how do we understand those? Because I think there's a lot of confusion, and people get a little bent out of shape when you call their theory anything but an integral theory, right? I see this all the time. People try and convince me of like, they're like, well, what's integral? And I'll explain it. They're like, oh yeah, I do that, and it's like, maybe, but not really. Like not in the way I'm actually trying to describe it. Like, right, like, so I just see this human tendency, like you don't want to feel like the theory you're committed to is less than, right? It's very strong, very kind of deep and understandable. So yeah, you guys should have an article. Find someone to do an article on defining all these different layers of theoretical activity, and how might we better understand when one becomes another.
Yeah, no, I love everything you're sharing there. It feels to me like the field itself is like growing into an actual meta discipline. Like this is the process of disciplining ourselves, like in a sense, like starting to converge on, what are the contours? These, do we actually agree with some of these distinctions? Are those the right criteria? Someone come along and critique your criteria, maybe nix a couple and add a couple, or, but eventually the field starts to cohere. Like, this is what it means for something to be an integrative meta theory. And this is what it means for something to be a meta theory alpha and a beta, and we start to develop a shared language and lexicon and more kind of intersubjective agreement about what's happening. So I think we're very much, in the early stages of that process, but it's exciting to see it unfold. I just have like one last question, and as we move towards completion. So we are headed into this synthesis lab in Lake Tahoe later in the fall. And you were such a integral player in and visionary, bringing together these different meta theories and bringing them into dialogue, co-organizing the Critical Realism Integral Theory Symposium series. Like, what words of wisdom do you have for us as we attempt to kind of, go into the next iteration of a very similar process to the one you began?
Yeah, what comes to mind is the importance of not just perspective taking, but perspective seeking, right? And so, like in Lectica's framework, I really like how they move from perspective taking to seeking to coordinating. And I think the danger would be you get a lot of people together and you're just kind of stay in the perspective taking mode. I think, and it took us a while in the crit series to get to the perspective seeking, where we're actually seeking the other perspectives and we are listening to the response in a way that we remained open to transforming our own views and thoughts and feelings about things. So perspective seeking is where you're in a dialogue that you're at risk of transforming yourself, right? And your own ideas and commitments and views, right? So you're not just trying to gather information to slot it into your big picture version of what, reality, right? So perspective taking is kind of almost like extractive in its orientation. Like it's like trying to scan the horizon, get information and like kind of pull it into your orbit. Perspective seeking is like more a process of kind of mutual transformation and dialogue and open, deep listening, active listening, right? And it's really out of that becomes, possible perspective coordination, which is probably what you're wanting to do as a group is to coordinate perspectives. So maybe thinking about like the sequence and like what exercises or prep work can you initiate so that when people arrive or soon after arriving, they can really enter into perspective seeking and really create a field of perspective seeking so that then after the symposium, all of you are really set up to engage in perspective coordination because you're probably not going to have the time and space to do the coordinating much at the event. There might be some of that. So I'd kind of like try and skip over the perspective taking piece, land in the perspective seeking, really, let people release their ontological and epistemological commitments and really show up together. Because I think one of the things you and I reflected on when we came up with that list of what allowed the Crit Symposium to be so successful was philo, right? The brotherly and sisterly love, right? So generating a field of connection, heart connection, that really becomes the basis for a longer term kind of coordination effort. And if you don't have that, it's harder. And coming together in person is a very unique opportunity. People are spending a lot of time, energy, and effort to get there, and money, right? So to really, focus on much on the field of relationality as you do on the content of the different theories, right? So my wisdom would be to put equal emphasis on both.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to hear how it goes. I'm so bummed I can't be there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you will be missed for sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your perspective.
Wait, it's just a perspective? What's going on here?
We went seeking for your perspective
Okay.
and you offered it. No, thank you for sharing your perspective here, at least, and in your presentation. Great stuff. Really, really valuable. Unfortunately, if you can't make the symposium, we hope that you can be as involved as you possibly can be in the whole project, because you're the wealth of expertise that you bring to all this is huge, and yeah, we would really appreciate it. So thanks for taking the time today, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. And yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm a fanboy of what you both are doing, and I am in general, and super excited to see how you just continue to bring us all together to have these conversations. Wonderful to have it today with both of you, and yeah, just lots of love, and just go get them. Yeah, the world needs you and what you're doing.
Thank you so much, brother, and thank you for all the leadership and pioneering efforts that you've done for so many years. That we wouldn't be here without you.
Well, it's easy when I get to hang out and connect with people like you. So it's that quality of connection and person I've always appreciated in the integral space, like really good people doing really good work. And it's always wonderful to connect and try and figure out how to contribute to the world. So yeah, we'll keep at it.
Indeed. Cheers.
Right on, man.
All right.
Take care.
Until next time.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.